So after Adeo's talk, I think most of you will have your life's purpose and work figured out. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the next step once you have that purpose, and that is figuring out the right co-founders for your company. So what I'd like to chat with you about is picking the right co-founders for your company, the logistics behind that, and what you want to do in that process. I hope that my talk is helpful for you also because I'm going to try and keep it full of anecdotes and also specific advice that I've gotten over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. I'd like to start out with a statistic, and that statistic is that 65% of companies fail because of issues between the management team. What that means is that 65% of companies have an awesome product, they've built great technology, they have strong sales, and yet the company fails. 65%. That statistic comes from Professor Noam Wasserman at Harvard Business School, and he studied 212 different startups from the 90s and 2000s in order to figure out that number. That is very alarming. What that says to us is that we need to make sure when we start our companies that we pick the absolute right people. Hi everyone, like I said, like Monty introduced, I'm Rohan. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you Monty for inviting me here. Thank you TiEcon for putting on this event. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and MindSumo so you have some context as to who I am and why my perspectives might be of some use to you at some point in your life. So I graduated from Stanford in 2009. I studied computer science there. I worked at a couple of different startups while I was in school. And then shortly afterwards, about a year or so after that, I started MindSumo with a couple of friends. MindSumo is a platform for connecting college students and hopefully soon high school students to companies. What we do is companies post some of the real world corporate challenges that they have, the real problems that they face, and students get a chance to solve these problems. So for students, it's a great way for them to prove their skills, get some real world experience, and also make some money in that process. For companies, one thing that's really critical is that they actually get high quality ideas from students, really creative ideas from our student community. The other thing that companies get, obviously, is also an opportunity to recruit some of the top students in the country based on the work samples that they produce and not something flimsy like a GPA or what major they studied, back in the day. So I'd like to start by discussing a little bit about my experience so far with MindSumo, what our co-founders looked like, what we look like as a company at the early stages. So my two co-founders are Trent and Keaton, and they are incredible people. I don't think they'll be watching this video, but I still want to put that out there. They're awesome people. Really good friends of mine over the past 4 years, but they also were really good friends of mine from well before then as well. Trent actually was is one of my oldest friends. I met him the first day of college. He was my freshman year roommate at Stanford. And our other co-founder, Keaton, went to Johns Hopkins, and we got to know him through Trent's volunteer work. I'll tell you a little bit about how I got to know them. But one thing I would like to point out is that Trent, Keaton, and I did not become co-founders because of the fact that we're friends. That's not at all why we decided to work together. That is one of the biggest pitfalls that you could possibly make in starting your own company. Picking people because they are your family or your friends is an incredibly dangerous decision to make. Instead, what we did was that we had a lengthy conversation over the course of several weeks where we discussed why we wanted to start the company together, why we felt like we would be good partners together, and then we had some really difficult conversations around that process. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those conversations as well. So I'll tell you first about Trent. So Trent, like I said, one of my oldest friends from college. He's a great guy. Some of my early memories with Trent are us skipping class in order to play FIFA. But no matter how much class we skipped to play FIFA, Trent never fell behind on schoolwork. I'm not talking that he was always hitting deadlines. I'm talking he was always a week or two ahead of every single class that he was in. Incredibly hardworking person, incredibly dedicated, and those are the kinds of traits that I actually was drawn to. The other thing with Trent is that I had worked with Trent on several different projects. Now, we had worked on school projects, so that's one subset of things that we had worked on. We had also worked on some independent study projects together. We had also worked on side projects, just fun stuff that we wanted to build together. Through those different things, what I realized was that Trent had a capacity to work hard, hit deadlines, and also respect me for the kinds of skills and talents that I brought to the table. That's part of the reason why Trent and I discussed working together, as opposed to us working with other friends of ours. It wasn't just that we were good buddies who had had great times over the course of 4 years of college. it was definitely a lot more than that. Now, Keaton is very different from Trent and I. So Keaton is somebody who is focused on business and sales. And part of the reason why we were really drawn to Keaton is that he's a former college athlete. And I don't know if you folks know a lot of the athletes in your school. I'm sure many of you are athletes out here in the audience, whether you're in high school or early in college. And one of the key things that you learn as an athlete is that you are hyper-competitive. You're incredibly competitive people. And Keaton is insanely competitive. He simply does not quit. One of the key things that we found was that in doing a lot of research and doing a lot of reading, that one of the key things that you worry about in a sales role is that person is super competitive. Now, Trent and Keaton were really close friends before I even got to know Keaton. I got to know Keaton as a friend before we ever started working together. And again, we could have just said, you know what, we're buddies, we probably get along, let's start the company. That's not how the conversation went. We sat down and basically planned out what our different skill sets are. So I come from a technical background, I studied computer science. Trent comes from a product design background, and he's an incredible artist. I had seen some of the art that he produced just for fun. He used to do sculptures, he used to do glass blowing, and all of these things I could tell he's a very creative person. Keaton, as I said, was a college athlete and extremely tenacious. He had had experience doing business development and sales, so when we came together, we realized that there were a lot of different personality traits that we had seen in each other while working together, while working on projects together, that could complement one another's skill sets. Now, these skill sets were also very complementary. So, as I said, I was technical, Trent is design, Keaton is sales, which meant that as 3 people on the founding team, we could pretty much take on any challenge that was thrown at us. And that's how the early investors in our company also looked at us, where they could tell that even though we were very inexperienced and we had no idea what we were doing in terms of starting a company, we could still figure it out to some degree. And I think that was one of the most critical things that we learned. Now, what I'd like to point out is, so Dharmesh Shah, who's the CTO and co-founder at HubSpot, talks about something that I think is absolutely fascinating. And that line is, friend and family co-founders are often the least likely to tackle the elephants in the room. And the elephants in the room that he talks about are relationships, roles, and rewards. I'll talk about those a little bit more as well. But if you can't have conversations about those 3 different topics with your co-founders right off the bat, or you feel any level of hesitation in having those conversations with them, then you're probably not in a good place to become co-founders with that person. You might be the best of friends, but if you're worried about hurting their feelings, unfortunately over the course of starting your company, that will happen. And if you're uncomfortable doing that, they might not be the best co-founder for you. Now, I'd like to discuss 3 questions that I think are very important before you start working with someone. The first question that I would ask, and this is a pure logistics question, but I think it is one of the most important questions that you can ask. And this also comes from Mr. Shah. The question is, how should we split shares in the company? That is a very challenging question because most people might start by saying, well, we'll split equity equally amongst the 3 founders. But what happens if one person comes in with 10 years of experience and the other person has just graduated from college? How do you figure out an equity split? At the same time, do you really want to put each of those 2 parties on different platforms? Do you want to put them in a situation where they're incentivized in very different ways? There is unfortunately no answer to this question. It's one that you have to hash out with your co-founders and figure out what feels right. But it is an incredibly important question that you need to ask at a very early stage. A lot of people fall into the pitfalls of saying, I will ask that question when I start talking to investors. By that point, it's unfortunately too late. I would say that's one of the earliest questions that you have to have. That's one of the tough questions you have to have in figuring out if you can even potentially work with someone. The second question that I would ask is, what are your personal goals with the startup? You need to understand if your co-founders are looking for this as a lifestyle business, which is to say you make strong revenues over the course of many years, you will probably work at that company indefinitely, and you have a good lifestyle over the course of that business. Or are you going for a high growth, raising lots of money from venture capitalists, that type of business? You need to figure out the difference between those because the risk-reward ratio and the decisions that you make at different steps of your company are going to be based on those personal goals that you have. The last question that I think is incredibly important is, how will we make decisions? How will you make decisions as co-founders? Who's going to make different decisions as they come up for the company? So for example, from our perspective, if there is a technology, product, infrastructure question that comes up, or a decision that we have to make in that sort of realm, I answer that question. I get to make that decision, and Keaton and Trent, they will give me the best advice that I could possibly get, but they will step back and respect me enough to let me make that choice myself. If it's something to do with sales strategy, I might do a lot of reading, but Keaton gets to make that decision. And that's one thing that we found is incredibly critical, because we don't have a lot of arguments when it comes to this sort of stuff, because we have our areas of expertise. And that's one thing that we realized early on as well, that we need to allow ourselves to make decisions, and we need to plan that out well in advance. The next thing I'd like to chat about is, one of the things that I think is especially tricky, and when I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and I was mentioning to him that I'd like to chat about this topic here at TiEcon, he asked me, where do you potentially find a co-founder? Because I just told him that he probably shouldn't work with friends, and he probably shouldn't work with family. Doesn't really leave a whole lot of people outside of strangers, and that's obviously very risky considering the massive commitment you're about to make to your company. So the caveat to friends is friends you might have worked with extensively. So if you've worked with a friend over the course of 5, 6 years on multiple different projects, or you have a coworker who you now consider a friend, that might potentially be a good sign of somebody who you feel is a person that you could eventually work with. Another place to consider is friends of friends, or anyone that you know who you might be able to get in touch with who has done independent projects. And one of the best ways, if you're interested in a technical company, is to look at open source projects. A lot of people who work on open source projects might be interested in potentially starting companies, but the key thing is that they're self-starters. You're looking for someone who's going to basically take a load off of what it is that you're trying to build and take care of a huge part of your business. You want somebody who's going to be able to be completely independent. And so those are a couple of the places that I would look at, but it's not an easy answer to that question either. Again, you're making a lengthy commitment. In my case, it's been 4+ years of working on this company. I have poured a lot of time and energy into it, and it's not an easy answer to say there's one specific source of co-founders. But from my experience, people you've worked with extensively are a great place to look, as are, of course, people that you have found who are self-starters, who are independent. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to point out, your co-founders are the most important assets in starting your company. You will have to make some of the toughest, most gut-wrenching decisions in your life with these folks. I think so my wife is in the audience, and she knows full well the difficult decisions that I have to make as part of running this company cause me to not get very good sleep. They mean that I don't eat that well, over the course of weeks. I'm super stressed out. And one of the key things that's really beneficial in having co-founders like the ones that I have are that I get to talk to them about these things that we all go through. And I think that's been one of the most critical experiences that I've had. Having their support and having their expertise involved in this entire process has been transformative for our company and helps us grow today. I'd like to take a second to thank Monty for inviting me here. Thank you, TiEcon, for putting this event together. I hope that some of this stuff was helpful to some folks. My email address is rohan@mindsumo.com. Feel free to email me. Thank you so much.